Look at the image before you. Focus on the shadows. Imagine the year is 1934. The place is Leningrad. The wind from the Gulf of Finland is biting, carrying the scent of coal smoke and iron, while the Western world was marveling at the rise of skyscrapers in New York. A different kind of structure was rising in the dark heart of the Soviet Union. Behind high stone walls and double-locked gates, Joseph Stalin authorized a project so secretive, so profoundly macabre, that it was systematically scrubbed from every official record for over 70 years. This was the Tower of Silence, deep within the Institute of Experimental Medicine, away from the eyes of the public and the reach of international law. Soviet scientists were tasked with a mission that bordered on the divine, or perhaps the diabolical. They were not just looking for cures for common ailments. No. They were looking for a way to conquer the final frontier, death itself. For Stalin, a leader obsessed with his own eternal legacy and the perceived immortality of the Bolshevik spirit, this was not science fiction. It was the highest priority of the state. The lead scientist behind this shadow project was Sergei Bryukhonenko. Bryukhonenko, a name that, to the Western world, is a mere footnote in a medical textbook. But inside these walls, he was the man who held the keys to the afterlife. Bryukhonenko was a brilliant engineer of the human body, but his brilliance was fueled by a cold, clinical detachment that bordered on madness. In 1928, he shocked the global scientific community by unveiling the autojector. It was a terrifying apparatus, a primitive heart-lung machine made of copper coils, glass valves, and rhythmic, thumping rubber bellows. To prove it worked, he performed the unthinkable. He displayed a severed dog's head, completely detached from its body, yet unmistakably alive. Those who were in the room described it as a nightmare come to life. The head blinked when bright lights were flashed. It flinched when the table was struck. It even licked its lips when citric acid was placed on its tongue. It was a biological machine, sustained by the hum of the autojector. When Stalin viewed the grainy, flickering film of this experiment, he didn't see a horror show. He saw a weapon. He saw a future where the greatest minds of the party, and perhaps his own, could be sustained forever, even if the flesh failed. Immediately, massive amounts of gold and resources were diverted from the starving provinces into this secret facility. The directive from the Kremlin was clear, and it was terrifying. The goal shifted from animals to humans. This was the beginning of the sleeper program. The Tower of Silence wasn't just a lab. It was a cathedral of high-tech necromancy. Bryukhonenko believed that the soul, or what he called the biological consciousness Keditiu, didn't leave the body immediately upon death. He theorized that it lingered, trapped in the decaying cells, like a fading radio signal. He believed that if he could provide blood, oxygen, and a perfectly silent environment, he could re-anchor that signal before it drifted into the void. Imagine the atmosphere inside that building. The hallways were lined with lead to block out the sounds of the city. The windows were bricked over. Light was provided by dim, flickering bulbs that hummed with a low, constant frequency. In the center of the tower, the autojectors were scaled up. They were no longer the size of a suitcase. They were massive, hissing machines the size of an industrial furnace, connected to rows of glass tanks, and inside those tanks, the first human subjects were waiting. They were the pioneers of a new, dark eternity. Men who had officially died on the battlefield, but whose journey was far from over. As the project moved into the mid-1930s, the Tower of Silence became a factory of the uncanny. The local population of Leningrad knew better than to ask questions about the black vans, the Chorny Vorony, that arrived at the gates long after the city's curfew. These vans didn't carry prisoners to the gulags, not yet. They carried the honored guests, high-ranking officials who had suffered heart attacks, decorated Red Army commanders fallen in freak accidents, and scientists whose minds were deemed too valuable for the grave. Inside the tower, the air was different. It was heavy, smelling of ozone, antiseptic, and something metallic, like the taste of a copper coin on your tongue. The staff called the subjects the sleepers. It was a term of cold, clinical respect. These men were no longer citizens of the Soviet Union. They were biological assets, suspended in a state that was neither life nor death. They were the residents of the lead-lined chambers, rooms specifically engineered to be so silent that you could hear the sound of your own eyelids closing. Why was the silence so important? Bryukhonenko theorized that the human consciousness was like a fragile radio frequency. In the moment of death, he believed the frequency began to drift away from the body, seeking the void. Any vibration, any sound, any light from the outside world would disrupt the signal, causing it to shatter. The Tower of Silence was designed to be a void of its own, a sensory vacuum where the consciousness had nothing to cling to except the mechanical pulse of the autojector. Imagine walking down those soundproofed corridors. You would see rows of heavy reinforced doors. Behind each door sat a sleeper. They were connected to the scaled-up versions of the copper-coiled machines, their chests rising and falling not by the command of their lungs, but by the rhythmic, hissing pressure of the bellows. Their blood was cooled, filtered through glass tubes, and pumped back into their veins by a heart that sat on a table next to them. This was Stalin's dream made manifest, a bureaucracy of the immortal, where the leaders of the revolution would never have to step down, because their bodies would never be allowed to rot. But the silence was never perfect. Low-level guards and cleaners, men who were chosen for their illiteracy and their loyalty, began to whisper about what they saw during the night shifts. One guard, who was later committed to a psychiatric ward, claimed that the sleepers weren't just sleeping. He spoke of the third eye phenomenon. He claimed that as he walked past the observation windows, he would see the sleepers' eyes snap open. But they didn't look at the room. They tracked things that weren't there, moving in perfect unison, as if watching a ghost walk through the lead-lined walls. There was a persistent smell of burnt hair and static electricity near the tanks. The scientists documented strange, rhythmic fluctuations in the electrical grid of the building whenever a new sleeper was anchored. It was as if the tower itself was breathing, pulling energy from the city to keep these phantoms tied to their flesh. The guards began to report a feeling of intense, crushing dread when they stood near the tanks, a sensation that they were being watched by something far larger and older than the men inside the glass. Bryukhonenko remained undeterred. He believed these were merely side effects of the resynchronization process. He was convinced that he was just steps away from a full, waking resuscitation. He didn't realize that by creating a perfect silence, he had created a vacuum. And in the world of the occult, a vacuum never stays empty for long. Something was beginning to stir in the tower. Something that didn't belong to the party or to the world of the living. By 1937, the atmosphere in the Soviet Union had turned into a fever dream of paranoia and blood. The Great Purge was in full swing. Joseph Stalin was cleaning house, and the supply of human material for the Tower of Silence became practically infinite. No longer did they rely on soldiers fallen in battle. Now, the subjects were political prisoners, former heroes of the revolution who had suddenly become enemies of the state. Among them, then was a man known in the classified files only as Subject 101. He was a former general, a veteran of the Civil War, a man whose chest was once covered in medals, but who now lay naked and shaven on a cold steel table. Subject 101 was unique. Unlike the others, he was strong. His heart refused to stop, and his brain activity remained abnormally high, even after clinical death. Bryukhonenko saw him as the ultimate vessel. He was to be the first subject for a triple resuscitation experiment, a bridge between this world and the next, built on the back of a dying soldier. The first two attempts at reviving Subject 101 were successful, but brief. He woke for seconds, his eyes darting around the room before the autojector hissed, and he slipped back into the gray. But the third attempt, performed in the dead of winter in 1938, was different. The power grid of Leningrad flickered as the massive copper coils hummed to life. The smell of ozone was so thick it was suffocating. The doctors watched as the filtered, oxygenated blood began to force its way back into the general's stiffening veins. The machine thumped, a heavy yet metallic sound that echoed in the soundproofed chamber. Suddenly, Subject 101's body arched off the table. It wasn't a natural movement. It was as if he were being pulled by invisible wires. His eyes snapped open, but they were devoid of any human recognition. They were bloodshot, wide, and fixed on a point in the ceiling that was empty. He didn't speak. He didn't gasp for air. He began to scream. It was a sound that didn't seem to come from human lungs. It was a low, guttural howl that resonated through the lead-lined walls, vibrating in the very bones of the scientists who stood watching. The scream lasted for nearly 3 minutes, without a single breath being taken. 2 nurses, seasoned by years of medical horrors, collapsed, unable to withstand the sheer psychic weight of the sound. When the general finally stopped screaming, he gripped Bryukhonenko by the wrist with a strength that nearly crushed the bone. He leaned in and whispered a single sentence that was recorded in the final frantic notes of the project. He didn't say he had seen heaven or hell. He said, "The silence is not empty. It is a door, and I didn't come back alone." Shortly after those words, Subject 101's body underwent a violent, convulsive rejection. The blood in the glass tubes turned black almost instantly, and the autojector exploded in a shower of sparks and boiling oil. The general died for the final time, but those who were in the room swore that his shadow remained on the wall, even after the body was removed. It stayed there for days, a dark, flickering shape that moved independently of any light source. Stalin was a man who feared no living rival, but he was deeply superstitious. When the report of Subject 101 reached the Kremlin, along with the accounts of the shadow that remained in the lab, the reaction was swift and total. The project wasn't just stopped, it was erased. The Tower of Silence was cleared in 48 hours. The machines were dismantled and melted down. The glass tanks were shattered. And the sleepers, those men who were trapped in the half-light of mechanical life, were finally and violently disconnected. We do not know what happened to the bodies. Some say they were buried in an unmarked mass grave beneath the foundations of the building. Others whisper that they were never buried at all, that they were transported to a new, even more secret facility deep in the Ural Mountains. Sergei Bryukhonenko survived the purges, but he was never the same. He was forbidden from ever speaking of the tower, and his later work was carefully monitored by the NKVD. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had sent him back with a warning that the Soviet state wasn't ready to hear. Today, the Institute of Experimental Medicine still exists, but the specific wing that housed the tower remains a place of shadow. Urban explorers who venture into the derelict parts of the facility speak of a lingering, wee, low-frequency hum that vibrates in the floorboards, even though no machines have run there for 80 years. They speak of cold spots and the feeling of being watched by something that exists just outside the range of human vision. The Tower of Silence may be gone, but the vacuum it created, the door it opened, might still be ajar. As you look at the old photographs of that era, the stone buildings, the unblinking eyes of the leaders, ask yourself, how much of our history is built on secrets we are too afraid to uncover? The Soviets tried to conquer death, but they only succeeded in inviting something else to the table. This has been Russian Dark Stories. The past is never as dead as we think it is. It is only waiting, in the silence, for someone to turn the machine back on. Sleep well if you can.